Welcome to another episode of What the Haze. I'm your host, Hayes Wolfenden, and today I'm interviewing the author, David Pariseau. Okay, welcome, David. Can you please, first of all, introduce yourself and your work? Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. First of all, I think it's wonderful what you do. My name's David Pariseau, and as far as the writing goes, I've just started writing a few years ago. Well, actually, I wrote for a while before that, but I started writing a few years ago and published my first novel, my debut novel, in November of last year. So just recently, I think I have a copy here, so in case anybody hasn't seen it. So Dreams
Nice,
of Verdure,
nice.
and then the second novel is just going to be coming out. So there's the second novel coming out in the series in just a few months. So we're just in arcs now, and so I did some writing. Oh, I think I've written on and off most of my life, and I was in a writing group for a bunch of years. Um, but then I got really busy with work-wise, and so engineer by training, and started a bunch of companies. Was a consultant for years and years. I designed electronics and embedded systems and things. Um, and so a few years ago, everybody was starting to ask me, about retirement, which is the big thing, the big goal, right? Because everybody wants to retire. Well, retirement really scared me, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I was really uncomfortable with the idea, just because I've worked my whole life, and I've always loved what I did. It was very creative. I created new products. I worked with lots of different companies, and it was such a big part of my life that I just didn't know what I was going to do with the hours, with the time. What could I do that would be as fulfilling? So we were on vacation, my wife and I, in Hawaii, and I was it was sort of always in the back of my mind, this whole thing of this retirement thing that everybody was so excited about. And I was playing around with the chatbots, which had just sort of coming out, and they had different characters, like Isaac Newton or whatever it is, and you could chat with them and create things. And I started just playing around with them and just forcing them into different situations, putting them on a job interview or just tweaking the narrative that was there. And it became really it sparked that writing bug again, just because you were creating situations and worlds and dialogues. There was some pushback from the chatbot, which would try to take it back into some direction, and it was very freeing. It limbered that muscle again that I really let lie dormant, except in writing articles and trade stuff. Um, And so I started playing around with some ideas. I went from that to just playing around with some just story ideas, like the way I used to. And one of those story ideas, I had a few of them. The first one was a take on the book Cold Mountain, and if you mashed it up with Starship Troopers, which are two pretty different genres, and having a sort of a more literary tale of a really campy sci-fi thing, which was pretty interesting with the characters. And then the other one that came to me as I started working on it was this young engineer who gets stranded on this jungle world. And that's where the idea for the book came. And I didn't start off as, hey, I'm going to write a novel. I was just going through this mental process of trying to deal with, what comes next, and not really understanding that I was just doing this to sort of pass the time, not really understanding that this would be a viable next act. And it just took over. It just all of a sudden I was writing a lot. I mean, I wrote the first drafts of the book in about a month, and I wrote the next 4 books about a month for each of them. So I wrote the entire series over the period of about 6 months, all 5 books. They were first drafts, so they were rough drafts, but they were pretty. I got to know the characters, and when I was first starting, you just don't know where it's going to go or what's going to happen. So by the time I got to the end of the 5th book and came back to the first one, I wrote the second draft of the first book, which is pretty close to what the final is. Just started from scratch, because then by that point I knew the characters, I knew the sort of the arc of the story a little bit more, and that draft, and I'd gotten some feedback. The thing that was wonderful for me is is I really did go out and get some beta readers. And, I hired a bunch of beta readers and a lot of them. So I was in a position to be able to do that. And then I found that they're not all created the same, um, that there's a very large spectrum there as far as what people like to read, what they're interested in reading, the kind of feedback you get. I had everything from folks that wanted to write the story for me, ghostwriters who basically said that they saw the story totally differently than I did, and by the way they would write it for me, which wasn't very helpful. Um, to people who just say, "Hey, I liked it," and that was the whole thing. To people who were really detailed, but maybe had a different vision, and then a few really gems who resonated with the story and who I've kept the entire way. Who read it and provide really thoughtful feedback as to, I just don't understand what's going on here, or what's this person feeling. And the first feedback I really got that was super helpful was that as an author, you tend to see the world much more clearly than your readers do a lot of the times. In other words, what you have in your mind as to what's going on, a lot of times is so much clearer than what you put on the page because you've already got it in your mind. You're already trying to move the plot along, and you see it really clearly. But one of the comments I was getting early on was, I can't really tell where they are. I don't really know what's going on. I don't really know what this person's, what this person's feeling. Um, and so that was really helpful in that the second draft of it, the novel with roughly the same plot elements, doubled in size, just because it became so much more immersive and so much richer in the setting of the in the actual setting. The world becomes a character largely, and the development of the people. All of the secondary characters, especially, became much more three-dimensional, um, because I already knew where they were going to go. I already understood their arc a lot more, their personality more. But two of them, just because I was much more intentional about um, developing that interaction, letting the reader, bringing the reader along, so that they could see it as clearly as I could see it. And one, it really helped me see it more clearly. Just by doing that, I was able to see it much more clearly myself. So that's kind of how it got started. That's the genesis and the origin of it, and a little bit how the novels evolved, um, sort of along the way.
Yeah, it's interesting you use beta readers. I'm using some beta readers as well for my current novel, but I've not paid them. But then the shortfall with that is I find that, obviously they've got lives and stuff. They're not getting me the feedback I need quickly enough. I've got a little bit that can go on that's good feedback that I'm going to use to edit a bit. But yeah, I have considered maybe paying. We'll see, or maybe maybe I can build my network and we can swap things like this. I don't know, but you do need to get good, quick feedback, I think.
Yeah, and I treat them so. It, and they're not all created the same. Like I said, I had maybe 30, and of the 30,
Oh,
probably three or four were the ones, 10% of them are the ones that work out. Same thing with arc readers. I mean, I've got a bunch of arc readers, and I paid a bunch of money to go on NetGalley. I got about 30 arc readers, of which I got zero reviews, zero.
oh,
So the arc readers I've gotten have been through my beta readers, through contacts I've made, other people I've gotten, and it's just
okay,
been by beaten bush. I think once you have an established name, the dynamics change a bit. But with a debut novel, that's
right,
really tough. It's really, really hard to get that out there initially. And I use my beta
yeah,
readers.
yeah,
They're almost alpha readers. So what I did was I would write 3 chapters. I would send them to the alpha readers, essentially the alpha readers, and then I would start working on the next 3 chapters. And then I would get the feedback from those first 3 chapters. I would rework those chapters based on the feedback, which would often change the dynamic going forward. Um, because if I'm getting the same comment over and over, hey, I don't really see what's going on, or this character was whatever, um, and they were really good because they didn't have a lot of ego tied into it. A lot of times, if you go with a critique partner, somebody has their own style. Unless you get a really good somebody who can really put themselves aside and really try to be, they're not trying to shape the story like something they would write, or they're not trying to uh, teach or guide you or whatever. They're trying to help, you know. So it's really hard to find the right critiques for yourself. It's really challenging, and it can be I think it can be arresting for some writers, right? You go out with something you think is really great, you give it to somebody, and it comes back all marked up with stuff that if you take the commentary and you don't know any better, you take the commentary and it turns into a book that you didn't really intend, you know, something you don't really care for, but you're just doing it because you think you should, or you just become so discouraged that you lose the spark for writing, um, I think it's a really tricky situation to find the right feedback partners, and they don't have to be paid. I mean, I'm in a situation where I could, and I spent a lot of money on editors early on, which was wasted because one, the novel wasn't really ready to be edited, and the comments I was getting back were not helpful to the novel. It needed fundamental changes. And even though they may have mentioned it, it wasn't helpful to me as an author because I just didn't understand I didn't know how to implement what they were telling me. You know, I get
Okay.
the old tropes, you know, show, don't tell, whatever. It doesn't help you at all if you're just starting out and you written, a first draft and that's your comment. Um, what, how do you show, where are the parts that really need the work and show me how to help me do it. Don't, it was not helpful in the early stages. What was really helpful in the early stages was more my beta readers who were really telling me the parts of the stories that how where they were getting lost in the story. And they often felt like it was their problem and not my problem. Well, I got a little confused here, and I don't read this genre very often, or it was couched in that way, which was really helpful because I could tell that there was no ego there. They thought that the fault was on their side, where really it was my I wasn't conveying the story effectively enough. Um, and finding the right support and the right voices was really critical for me. And you want people also that you want a smattering. It's nice to have somebody who's a little bit of a cheerleader. Oh yeah, I really love this part. I really like that part because it's a slog, and you're writing a novel and all you're getting back is feedback that's, yeah, this isn't working, that's not working. I don't know what's going on here. Um, and you're putting in, essentially all your free time into this thing. Um, and trying to get this way can be discouraging. Whereas somebody, a kind word every now and then saying, "Hey, this was really cool. I really laughed here." It buoys the spirit a bit and really helps you get through those through the process of creating these things. They took a few years from the time I had that first idea until I was able to debut the novel. I wrote the second novel um, before I launched the first. I finished the second novel, pretty much finished. I did a couple more editing passes, but I didn't want there to be a large gap between book one and book two, so that if I got some readers and there was a momentum a little bit, I could follow through with that second book pretty quickly. Um, Sort of my idea, but I don't know if that's going to work out. Well, I think it's going to work out, but it was a lot more work.
Yeah, it sounds a lot of work, to be honest. I think writing is, though. I think, when you obviously write first drafts and then you edit, you send them out to beta readers, you get feedback, you re-edit. It just takes time. There's and dedication. There's no other way to really do it. I was going to say, I listened to what you say, and yeah, it's interesting that when you send your novel out for to be edited or to be, you want to call it critiqued, read, or you can pick your word. I'm always reminded of what like Neil Gaiman said about this, is that if you're reading someone else's work, you've got to critique it like it's their work, not like you're writing it. And most people will probably critique it like they're writing it. So it's almost useless. That's one of the problems, and it's just kind of like, it's best off just to kind of, like you mentioned, show not tell. I'm a big fan of show not tell, but you're right. It's got to be specific, and you've got to
Well,
say, well, look at this bit here. You could do it like, there's another thing about like critiquing is like, I've got some students at school and I'm trying to tell them this. I try to just go, I ask them questions and just say, have you thought about this? And you know what? you could be wrong, as in I could be wrong. The reviewer, the editor could be wrong, and yeah, I can imagine it was quite confusing, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think the the good thing for me is that I was far enough along in my life, and I'd been through a lot of my career that I understood that the process was going to be a learning curve. I expected it to take some time. And so what I needed was feedback that would help me grow as an author and to be able to discern what feedback would help me and which wouldn't. As a brand new young author, let's say I was in my 20s or something, I would have been overwhelmed and unable to maybe make that differentiation. I was old enough and I'd gone through enough of my life. In other words, in my career as an engineer, you're always getting feedback, and you start to learn to discern which feedback is helpful and which feedback isn't. And so that was really helpful to me to be able to find the voices, because people say show don't tell, but I think tell don't show is just as viable, because there's plenty of
Yeah, there's
places
a
where you should be telling and not showing, where showing doesn't add to it just becomes tedious. In other words, if you show everything, in other words, I get up, I go brush my teeth, I go to the kitchen, I make myself a cup of coffee, and then I go, get dressed and comb my hair, and now I get in the car and now I'm driving down the road. Well, none of that was useful to the story unless something happened in there. But I'm showing, I'm not telling, I'm not saying, hey, he got up that morning, went to work. In that sentence, people know what that means, right? But if I'm showing, not telling, um, I'm not serving the story. So I think a good tell don't show is really powerful in some places where you want to convey some information, but there's nothing. You just want the passage of time or a transit from here to there, or where nothing substantial is happening, but you don't need to show it because it just becomes boring. It's hard to sustain it. Plus, the dramatic parts where there is action going on, or something substantial in the dialogue, you pay pay closer attention to it if it stands in opposition to exposition, a little bit of exposition here. Again, you don't want to drag out. So many stories start that, hey, I'm going to tell you about the world, and here's my 5 chapters of world building before we actually see a character and anything happens. I mean, that's just not going to fly, right? The average person's going to read a chapter or a page and not be drawn into it, because you need the emotional investment. You need to find, for me, if I'm reading a story, I need to be captured by some emotional. I need to be emotionally invested in the story early, very early. Um, and if not, then it's hard for me to slog through. There's this world and there's these people and they have these jobs, and if I don't care about any of them, I don't really want to go on the journey. I'm busy. I'm tired. I got, at the end of my day, um, why do I care about this other world unless there's somebody I care about? I don't have to be sympathetic, but I have to be intrigued enough to want to go on that journey. So I think it's important to pull somebody in, but you also have to set the world a little bit, because if you also just have characters and you don't see anything, you can't figure out where they are, what they're doing, or why there's stakes, or what's going on. Then it could be the other way. I have a lot of stories where I've read where the characters are really interesting, but there's really nothing going on, or they're meandering around, or they're repeating the same things over and over. It starts to get tiresome, because you're like, okay, well, aren't you going to do something, or aren't you going to grow, or aren't you going to face anything, or is there nothing happening in here, or the author really loves these characters and we're just going to spend time with them. That's okay for a while, but and it doesn't have to be huge stakes, right? They don't have to be changes saving the world, but there has to be something, right? Some arc for growth, or development, or interaction, or something.
Oh yeah, for sure. I like what you mentioned about journey. Yeah, I think the readers do need to. I mean, okay, myself as a reader, especially with characters, maybe even the world. I like to know, or believe that the character is going to change over time, or maybe even the world is going to change over time, or or maybe a better way of putting it is the world's not changed. The world is the world. Maybe the narrator, the author, is going to show me different parts of the world, maybe especially with every book. That's what I
Hmm.
think. That's one of the things about Game of Thrones when it was first released that people got excited
Yeah.
about. Every book there was something new happening in a different part of that world, and it wasn't just the same characters running around the same parts of Westeros. It started going into Essos as well, and that for me was exciting at the time.
Yeah. And in Game of Thrones, the characters, you didn't necessarily like all the characters or want to spend time with all the characters, but there was enough of a variety in that there were characters that you did care about. There's a few that, a few of the plot points or the story arcs I didn't care for as much, and I could sort of gloss over those ones a little bit and then get back to the ones I really enjoyed. But the variety was nice.
Yeah, with Game of Thrones, I think in the end it just became like there was too many characters.
There was a lot of
Um,
characters. Yeah.
yeah, and by the time it gets to book 4, book 5, there was like established characters that had been killed off, and the books missed them, and the ones that had been set up to take their place, I forget the names now. The
Yeah.
ones from like the Iron Islands, they just weren't as they were effective in their own way, but they just didn't quite grab you the same way. And it is what it is. I shouldn't criticize too much. I still think it's a great
No, no,
series.
I think it's interesting because it departed um from what was traditionally done. I think that's the thing that was people like to see something that's fresh, right? If you're just doing the same book that everybody else has done, it's interesting, but it stops being interesting a little bit. If you really have a different point of view, people are going to feel differently about it. They're going to be, the stakes are higher all of a sudden, right? Because now the characters you care about, you don't know that they're going to make it at the end. Uh, whereas, you sort of believe that about most books, right? Oh yeah, here's the main character. Everything's going to come out fine in the end, which is okay. That's a good book, but now you have a book where right away the main character in the first book he's dead at the end,
Yeah,
and so you're like, okay, so now essentially anything can happen, and that's interesting because it's fresh, right? It's interesting and it's fresh, but it's like you say, it has its double-edged sword a little bit, right? So you're killing off the characters that people care about. What are you left with? So I think you have to either do a really good job of introducing new characters, but then do people really want to become invested in these characters because they don't know whether they're going to make it past a chapter or two?
yeah. I think sometimes that's where writers, published authors, they need a good editor,
Mm.
to just have a little whisper in their ear and go, "Do you really want to do this?" Like it reminds me of there was a young adult book I read years ago called "The Knife of Never Letting Go," and it's
Mm.
about this alien world where you can hear not just what other people think, but like animals as well. So you can hear what animals think, and so people like go mad from it and stuff. And the story follows the main boy character, and he's got like a pet dog. And at the end of the book, the author kills off the dog,
Oh.
and it's pretty gruesome. But that's it, the thing is, the dog is the funny element, the comic relief, because it's got all these funny like thoughts, and it's really good. And so you get to the second and third novel, just not that good. Being honest, the other animals are not nearly as effective, and it's quite repetitive at times. And it's one of those things. Just imagine if you didn't kill off the dog, how good the rest of the series would have been. It's I must admit at the time I just couldn't fathom why he would have done it. It made no
Yeah.
sense to the story whatsoever. It wasn't necessary. I don't know. These are the things that happen. Unfortunately, we read books all the time, don't we?
Yeah.
And we go, why has it gone like this? I was talking to someone about this, and a few years ago I was reading this. As it turned out, it was a romantasy novel. I didn't know what romantasy was then. But the first half of it was really good. This new world, angels, our world, the angel world, parallel universe. It's really interesting. But then the second half, it's just romance to the
Mm.
point where you're like, oh my God, what's going on? It's like, I really love him. I really love him. I really love her. Hundreds of pages. And it's like, why have you done that? The good thing about that is, if we can take one bit of cheer, is that published authors, traditionally published authors that make millions and sell millions, still make really pretty basic mistakes. I personally think it should give us a lot of hope that we can do it, especially if we can see these errors as well. What I was going to ask as well, David, going back to your Ndesa series, what is it mainly about?
Yeah. So it's there's a few things to it. So it's a young engineer from a spacefaring world, right? So he grows up on a desert planet and grows up a little bit of a loner. He's gifted in the sense that his parents are both professors and they're really involved in the career. He overhears one night that he's sort of an accident. They didn't expect to have him. They never tell him that, but they give him every opportunity. So he has tutors. He's advanced, but he's always a little bit of a loner. He doesn't have kids his age. So, and he's a dreamer a bit, right? He basically he just wants to graduate and get a job and see the stars. So he gets a job on as an engineer on a mining ship that's prospecting out in uncharted space, and there's an accident on the ship. This all happens in really early first chapter, essentially. And he's the only survivor. And he manages to make it to an escape pod. He's injured, and he lands on this planet, and he's unconscious, essentially. He's very injured. So he's the main male character, and then there's a female character. So the people in this jungle world, in this rainforest world, they live all in the upper canopy of the rainforest. So off the ground, way up in the trees, and they see this ball of fire through the sky, and it lands in the forest next to them. Nearly kills them as it goes by. And so they go to investigate. They find this creature essentially in this what they think is this large egg, and it's injured or whatever. The main female character is really independent young woman. The at the very beginning is a little preface that basically says this is a world, a universe essentially that was seeded by some older race that seeded life throughout, the various planets on this thing and adapted them somewhat, right? Because I didn't want to have a planet of spiders and a planet of whatever, snails or whatever it is. I wanted to be humanoid and to make it some sense why there would be reasonable humanoids. So they're all genetically similar but different a little bit. So they all have hands and eyes, and they're all somewhat human. So they bring him back to the village essentially, and a bunch of stuff happens. But essentially, he ends up having to face a bunch of different trials in order to be accepted in the tribe, whatever. So it's their ritual, but he doesn't know anything about the planet. He's never lived on anything like it, and so it's really insurmountable. Nobody expects him to live through any of it. And then there's small elements of magic in the sense that nobody's casting spells or anything, but it's more natural in the sense that there's seers who can sort of glimpse parts of the future. They get visions. They can't always make sense of them. The young woman has the gift of touch, where she can touch somebody and actually feel their thoughts. But she always thought it was a curse. She had an experience with it. She's never tried to use it or whatever. And then there's a bunch of other little bits and pieces along the way. But it's essentially so it's essentially coming of age. They're both young adults trying to find their way through life. And so there's that element to it. And there's the element of found family, right? He's always been searching for his place. He thought he found it on the ship. He had camaraderie with the people that were there, finally felt like he belonged, and that was ripped away from him. And he then eventually, might find it on this weird world. And so it's sort of along the lines. It's heartwarming. It's lots of adventure. Some good characters. I mean, the characters have really gotten rich. The world itself is really immersive. So it's very cinematic in a way. I mean, you really get a sense that you can see what's going on, as it's happening around you. So it's a little bit of an Avatar-like feel, like the movie, a little bit, but it's not quite. In other words, Avatar had more of the great white human, despoiling this world. It doesn't have any of that kind of motif or themes or whatever. It's more, just a person finding, really the found family theme is strong in there, and really adventure. So it's a good read. There's a little bit of romance, just a tiny bit, between the two characters, but there's no spice or anything like that. It's more feelings, and it's more a feeling of belonging, just of happy. We all want to have a place where we belong, where we find that, and that's really the heart of the book.
Yeah, what was the inspiration then behind the world? You do mention about the like a bit like an Avatar feel. Yeah, when you were talking about it, yeah, I pictured it, straight away.
Yeah,
like Congo, tips of the trees. Yeah, what was the reason or reasoning behind like having like is the whole world a rainforest world or
yes,
just like part of it?
no, the whole thing. There's a mountain range that's involved. In the first book, you really only see the first book's the village. So the whole book's centered around the village. He really doesn't have scope beyond that. The second book expands it a bit, and you start to see other villages and interactions with other things going on. And then it grows, in subsequent books, it continues to grow a little bit. But I wanted to make it one. I wanted to show the contrast, right? It comes from a desert world. Most of the cities are underground. They're built beneath the mountains, sand, dirt, whatever it is. Um, he's from a technological world, right? They fly in the stars. They have starships. They have science. Now you have the total opposite, which is a jungle world, really rich, really humid, lots of rain, um, lush forests, totally different than anything he's ever used to. It's a fish out of water a little bit, right? And then I wanted to make it different, not just jungle, not just Avatar, but I set it high in the rainforest, in the trees. So it's tree houses. The people have these lanyards, which essentially allows them to swing through the trees. So the world takes place well above the forest floor, and the forest floor for them is really dangerous. There's a lot of predators down there and things, and they're afraid of the forest floor. And part of the trials take place there. Um, and so I wanted it to be somewhat different, not just, Tarzan of the Jungle or Avatar or something like that. Um, but I wanted it to be, somewhat unique, but not so unique that it was unfamiliar and it got gimmicky to the point where you're like, spending all your time trying to come up with something new that doesn't add to the story.
Yeah, you're mentioning about, I think you said predators. What are the animals like on the planet? Like, what do they
They're
look like,
similar
act
to
like?
similar to animals that we might, I didn't make them that different. So there's essentially like wild boar, there's packs of like hyena-like creatures, there's large cat. The apex predator is a really large, sort of jaguar-like cat, very large. So I didn't want to make the animals unrecognizable, like large. There's a few that are a little different, but in general they're recognizable. So that as soon as, like, you mentioned a little bit about it, you don't have to describe it in huge detail and go into a huge world building thing about some six-arm thing with whatever.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sounds interesting. You mentioned about one of the themes was like a found family. Why have you gone with that theme? Why has that been included, or why'd you pick it?
I think it plays to him a little bit. I think it plays to all of us, really. Everybody wants to find their place, right? So it's a strong theme. And, if you're not going to lean into the romanticy side, if you're not going to make it a love story where the person finds their forever person, um, then I think you have to have something that the character wants, as opposed to, hey, I just want to stay alive. Everybody wants to stay alive, uh, but it works from both sides, right? I mean, a bunch of the characters become attached to him through the story. There's some strife in the village. There's a lot of tension that happens, and they also want to build that with him. So I think it's a universal thing that we all kind of want. I mean, if you look at most things, it's most books, you can find that same theme in all those books, right? Whether it's Game of Thrones, the people are wanting to belong or wanting to be a part of something, or whether it doesn't really matter what book you pick a book. It's kind of there, that feeling of finding your place. And it was compelling, and it also fell out of a little bit of his life, right? I mean, he's always been a loner who's been really looking for that. I mean, he hasn't had hardship in the way of a lot of death or a lot of whatever. And on this jungle world, death is a real big possibility, right? People often go into the jungle, don't come back, kind of thing. So that's a unique it's a new thing for him, the idea of being able to lose people. Um, and some things happen along the way, but. And you're talking about earlier one point that you did make, which was, I thought, interesting, um, about the dog, right? The author kills the dog, and as an author, there's often an interest in being surprising or in being novel. In other words, hey, I'm going to do something nobody expects. I'm going to kill the dog
Yeah.
because that's neat. Nobody expects that, and so people will get to it and they'll go, oh my god, he killed the dog, and you can think, hey, that's a cool idea, but then you give it to your beta readers, and they're like, you killed the dog.
Yeah.
And they don't get beyond. They're surprised, all right, but maybe not in the best way possible. As far as because you are sharing a story with them, um, and you can write it for yourself and do whatever you want to do, obviously. But if you're writing a story that you really want other people to resonate with, um, killing the dog isn't always the best idea, even though it can be the surprising turn. Um, Making it that people think you momentarily killed the dog is maybe more powerful, because or killing the characters that people have come to love. In other words, if Martin had killed Jon Snow in the
Yeah.
second book or whatever it is, it might not have gone the full 5 books, right? Or Daenerys or whatever. If he'd have killed the people that were the heart of the story, which he sort of does in the first book, with Ned Stark or whatever.
Yeah.
It For me, I didn't get beyond that at that point because one, there was no other character in the book I cared about. I didn't care about anybody else really, because they were all conniving, especially in the books. In the series that they did, the HBO series, they did a better job. The actors did a really good job of bringing out their humanity, but you don't see that in the first book. So you have this one character who you really care about, but he's doing stupid things the whole time. So at some point you're like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Why are you going along with this? And at some point, and then you kill him. And so at that point, okay, all right, I'm spending all this time in characters I don't care about. I don't like, I don't enjoy. You're not making him redeeming in any way. And then you kill the one guy who looks like, I keep expecting him to grow, and he doesn't. So I think you have to make those decisions carefully. And I think your beta readers are great, really good readers. For me, one thing I learned about writing is I expected it to be a solitary endeavor. In other words, you sit there. I always imagine this the way the book gets written, right? You sit there in a room, you have this thought, you type it all out, and essentially you have the entire book pretty much done. And then an editor comes in and puts in a few commas, uh, you know, asks you about a word choice here or there, but essentially that's the whole process. And then it gets printed and then it ends up on a bookstore shelf, which is what makes it intimidating, right? Because if you imagine that the books you've read came out like that, you're like, holy shit, I can't do that. I mean, I can't sit there and write a book that well in a sitting, or
Yeah.
you see the novelist in a cabin somewhere, uh, cranking out this magnum opus over the period of a couple weeks, and then being done and hands it to his editor. And that's the way it's portrayed a lot. And so if you're looking at that, you're saying, well, I couldn't do that. But it's so much more collaborative than I ever imagined. And I was an engineer. I was collaborating my whole life. And I approached the writing that way. Um, and I surrounded myself with people who knew more than me, and also with readers, not just like other authors who are trying to, who know whatever it is. And the readers don't necessarily know how to fix the problem. Is it Oscar Wilde that said that? Said,
I
they don't
don't know.
always know. They don't always know. They always know what's wrong. They don't always know how to fix it. Um, so they'll point out something that's nagging at them, or I don't really understand why so and so did this, or this happened, whatever. And if you know that it's going to get answered, or that it was important for them to have that feeling, then that's great. But if it comes to you as a surprise, you're like, what? I shouldn't have killed the dog. If that comes to you as a surprise, then there's an opportunity there before the book gets published to fix it, um,
Yeah.
so that you don't lose your readers.
I think when you're reading a book and you become emotionally invested in characters, and we mentioned earlier that word journey, it reminds me of like the book The Maze Runner. There was
Mm.
it's not a great book, it's an okay book,
It was okay. It
but
was good. It was a good story.
yeah, I like the world. I like the world actually. I like the maze. I like the opening a lot. It's a really good opening. There was a
Hmm.
secondary character. I think his name was Chuck, and I could be wrong. He was like a short, like fat kid
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
everybody bullied, and he
It's
was
like
the comic
Piggy in
relief.
Lord of the Flies, a little bit, right?
Yeah, and he was a really good character to follow and kind of grow with. And then he just got killed at the end, and then I tried to read the second book, and it just wasn't
Mm.
good.
Right.
And it missed that character. It's
Because
just
he gives it humanity, right? He gives the book
yeah,
humanity, uh, that
yeah.
that we sorely need. And I have characters like that in my book. And those are characters turn out to be some of the strongest ones people relate to. Not
Yeah.
necessarily the main characters they like, but it's the secondary characters, the ones that are the underdogs, the ones that are trying and that really are the heart a lot of times of that story, of the world, that make you want to live there. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I
it's really
mean,
powerful. Those little things, and we don't always notice them. Sometimes the author puts that in there, not thinking that just wanting to have some variety in the characters. Not everybody's able to do everything, but misses the misses the value of those characters. I think they're really valuable. That humanity is really
yeah,
valuable.
yeah, it's true. I think for me, if I want to kill a character off, a secondary character, I'm typically I'm gonna do it with someone that I think's maybe not interesting, or in my mind when I'm writing it, and I know I'm writing it, and I'm like, this character isn't quite doing it for me. They need to be there for whatever reason. They're friends with one of them or something, but something's going to happen. So I'll do something, but a comic relief person, which is it's probably not that's not a fair summary of
No,
those
I know
kind of
what you mean.
characters. They're more than comic relief. They give a bit of
It's the character that has the humanity, right? The character that
yeah. You
is
said
human.
humanity, and I
Yeah,
think you also said contrast. I think they provide contrast as well
yeah.
between the main character as well. And so without them, you're right, you don't quite have the humanity, don't quite get the contrast. And yeah, as a reader, I feel kind of let down at times. I'm like, oh, I was invested in that character, waste of time. That can be annoying.
Yeah,
My
that
first
feeling
novel,
you just mentioned, I think is really critical. The waste of time. In other words, you have a certain amount of energy you can invest in the book, like emotional energy. And then when you found out that that's wasted, in other words, I really cared about this part of your book. I really resonated with it. And now this is the part of the book that really was heartwarming to me. And now you've ripped that away. So I'm left with the rest. And I'm looking around and there's not really anything else that I care about as much as what you just took away. Um, and that's a problem, I think. It may not be a problem from the first book. You leave it and you're like, okay, well, I like parts of it. It was good, but it makes you really leery about picking up that second book, right? Because then you feel like the author's going to do that to me again, and I
true.
didn't like that, and so I don't necessarily want to go down that road again with you because I don't trust you as an author anymore. That you're not going to make me care about something and then take it away. Um,
Yeah.
And I don't like main characters who can do everything, right? You've got the ex-Navy SEAL who plays the cello, uh, wrote a symphony, and also by the way, he's a mathematics PhD uh, who hang glides on the weekend. And okay, does a person like that exist? I don't know, but he's not relatable, and everything comes easy to him. In other words, he does everything, and he's never really in peril, and he never has second doubts. And so, is he really human? Is he relatable? I like the guy who's trying but stumbles. Not stupid. Not he does his best. He's not like always falling in the same trap or whatever it is. I don't like that guy too much. But somebody who's like human, who's not the best at whatever it is, but gives it everything he has, and somehow the people around him, with their help and with his own whatever and some luck maybe, is able to hang on and persevere. I mean that journey is much more interesting to me for me.
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. I think so. I don't know if is it a trope of modern literature. I've seen a few characters popping up like that. I mean, I like the Jack Reacher books to an extent, but the last one I read, he was a bit like that.
Yeah.
He
I
seemed
think
to
I
be
read
able to do
almost all those
everything.
books,
And
and they were just purely. I mean, you read them; it's almost like James Bond, right? You read them not expecting that there's going to be a lot of growth in the character, not expecting really a whole lot from the story, aside from the fact of just being entertained with him like beating up a bunch of people and somehow coming out on top. Um, you don't see much. You really don't see much from that character. But I think it's after a while it gets old, right? Because it's the same book over and over.
yeah, yeah, yes,
Uh,
yeah,
it's just you just change the place and you change the names and maybe but it's the same book. It's a formula that after a while, it's comforting. It's a little bit like watching something where you're not expecting, what you're going to get when you go in. Like James Bond, going to be a lot of chase scenes. It's going to be a lot of shooting around. They're going to chase him. They're going to put him in an impossible situation. He's going to escape from that, and at the end, he's going to save the world. and that's
Yeah.
okay. There's a place for that, and that's enjoyable going into it. But it's not the other. James Bond's not going
Yeah,
to
I totally agree.
he's not going to become a different guy at the end of the book, right?
Yeah.
He's not going to all of a sudden, uh, settle down with a white picket fence somewhere and have a little hobby farm. That's not going to be him.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. I was going to ask you as well. Do you have any like favorite like sci-fi and fantasy, whether it's TV, movies, or books?
Yeah, I mean a lot. I mean I read a lot of different things, so not just sci-fi. Well, we talked about a bunch of different things, is but I really loved sci-fi and fantasy growing up. I mean, I read a lot of it. And, I was into D&D early on, like way back before anybody knew what it was. And I grew up in northern Canada, so I was the only, me and two other guys were the only guys who I think maybe within 200 miles of us had any idea what it was. Um, so I read a lot of different things. I read, Lord of the Rings and those things. As a matter of fact, I'm just rereading it now, and I mean the book. I don't think the book would ever fly now, just because it meanders so much initially. It's interesting, and it's fascinating because he envisioned a world that had never, he was breaking new ground. And so it's really interesting to see how things have changed over the period of 100 years or whatever it is. Um, which is pretty dramatic. It's pretty dramatic there. But I like a lot of different things. I really like Jim Butcher, the Harry Dresden series specifically, but he wrote another series as well. That was really interesting. And mostly the humor in it and the humanity of the main character is what really drew me to that series. Martha Wells, the Murderbot thing. And again, even though Murderbot is essentially a robot, semi cyborg kind of thing, the humanity in there is what really draws you in. That it's a found family story a little bit too, right? I mean, searching for his place, searching you know, for himself through that thing. Geez, there's so many of them. Trying to come up with uh, Zelazny, I really loved growing up. The Nine Princess Amber. I don't know if you ever read that series, the first five especially, and that's something that I really enjoyed growing up. Recently, I read the Dungeon Crawler Carl. I don't know if you've seen those books. Um,
No.
they were really interesting, and that brought me back to the old D&D days, the Dungeons Dragons books, game. So, and it's not something I would normally pick up, but the just to preface what the story is, essentially, it's this guy. The whole world gets sort of taken over by this alien race and turned into essentially a game that they bet on and they watch, like a reality game. And they essentially, anybody who's inside essentially gets killed initially, and all the people that are outside get stuck in a dungeon, and they have to face a bunch of different things and either kill them or get killed, and then move on and level up and get whatever magical items and stuff like that. And that part's not that interesting. I mean, it's interesting, but the part that is interesting is the humor that's sort of built into there. So it's this guy who gets caught outside because he's trying to save his fiance's cat from a tree, and he's standing outside in his underwear. And now he ends up in the dungeon in his underwear with this cat that's always been, um, uh, it's never liked him. So
Right. Yeah.
they've always had this adversarial relationship, but they're together now because his fiance, ex-fiance, or whatever it is, dumped him and left him with their cat. And that's the premise that's cute, is the two of them, and the cat early on now can speak. Something happens and whatever, so now the cat can speak and is really
Okay.
snarky, a little bit like that dog you're talking about. And that's what
Yeah.
carries the story, is the story of this guy in his underwear running through the dungeon with this snarky cat, and their weird relationship that grows over time, um, as they meet other characters in situations. But it carries the story in a way that's really compelling. Um, then anything that Andy Weir's written, I love, just because he does such a great job of
Okay.
characterization in the worlds he creates. And again, the Hail Mary, which is his latest, has that humanity again, that feeling of found family, and because essentially it's a found family trope as well, right? I mean, at the end he finds his family, which is not the family he initially thought. John Scalzi's stuff I like. Dan Willis is an author that you don't see a lot of. His books, I don't know where they're distributed. I think maybe out of the UK or somewhere. I'm not sure where. But it's not one I see a lot, but I really enjoyed. So he had books, and the premise of that is runes, written runes that actually have power and can do things.
Oh,
But it's like a little bit like a noir kind of feeling to it, like 1930s, like Sam Spade kind of thing, and he's a rune write. It's really kind of cute and well done. Oh geez, so many, but those are just some of the ones that come to mind.
yeah, I need to read more Andy Weir. I know I've seen the movie The Martian. I kind of wish I'd read the book first. Now I've
They're both
seen
very
the
good.
movie.
I've read the book several times, and I've seen the movie multiple times, and
Yeah.
they both stand alone really well. Matter of fact, there's some things in the book that are not in the movie because they have to cut stuff, right?
Okay.
There's a
Okay.
bunch of additional things that happen in the book that you don't see in the movie, just because they just don't
Right.
have the space for it.
Yeah, it looks. Yeah, I should. No, I really should. I should read it. What's Hail Mary about?
It's the basic premise is that the Earth is facing a huge problem because of the sun. Something's going on with that, and life on Earth is in prospect of potentially ending, and we don't really understand what's going on. So they put together a spaceship with a few people on, some scientists and a few other people on it, to send out to try to figure out what the hell's going on. And
Okay.
everybody on the spaceship uh, essentially dies except for one guy on it, who's like an ex. And this is a little stretch. This little part here is an ex middle school science teacher. Um, but it's his journey as he tries to figure this out, and he encounters a ship from another world with a different race, a different creature on it, and who's
Okay.
also trying to do the same thing. They're trying to figure out what's going on because they're going to die as well. Their planet
Oh,
is
okay.
under the same jeopardy, and it's their unlikely friendship and um, and interaction that carries the book. That's the heart of the book. It's those two characters, and they're very different. And he's not humanoid. The other character's not humanoid, but
Yeah, it sounds interesting. Yeah.
it's really well done. And Hail Mary, I think, is along the lines of, I one last gasp effort. How do we save our planet and our race? But it's really that friendship that carries the book.
Yeah, I'll have to definitely check both out. Like I said, Andy Weir is just a writer. It's just kind of it's been on my periphery, and I've just he's stayed there. I'm aware of him. I've just not checked him out, and I should do.
Yeah, he did Artemis,
Um.
which was set on the moon, which was okay.
Oh, okay.
It was it was good, um, but it wasn't as good as The Martian or Hail Mary, which were both, I
Okay.
think, really good.
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out for that one. What was the book you were talking about the guy locked outside in his underwear with the cat? What's the name of that book? That
The
sounds really
Dungeon
interesting.
Crawler Carl,
Say it
and
again.
it's Dungeon Crawler Carl,
Right. Oh,
and it's
okay.
not a book. Again, I kept seeing it on, I think, YouTube or something. People kept talking about it, kept being reviewed, and I was like, what is this book? And I just got it from the library just to have a look. I figured, this is not going to be something that's, because the lit RPGs thing, literary role player game kind of stuff, is not something I normally read. Just
Yeah.
because a lot of times it's a recap of some adventure somebody went on, and they're just giving you a chronicle of what happened, and it's not often a novel. It's not really, they're really enjoying writing up what happened, but it's usually plot points, and it doesn't have the characters and all that other stuff. So it's not normally a form I'm that interested in. But this one, and I've read, I think, 5 of them. The fifth one, you started to lose me on it a little bit because we start to we start to get a lot of characters, a little bit like we were talking about Game of Thrones. You start to end up with lots and lots of
Yeah.
characters, and the plot point keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we start losing the um, the depth of the interaction between the main characters, the cat and the guy, which is really the heart of the story. We still
Okay.
see them, but that dynamic is starting to wane for me. And I don't really care about a lot of the other characters. I really care about them and the story. And I understand where the author's going with it, but it's losing me. And I think, I don't know how many books there are, but there's a bunch of them. I don't know, maybe 10 or whatever it is, and they get bigger and bigger.
Right.
Yeah, some of these are huge, and I'm like, okay, at some point, you need to you need to feed me a little bit,
Yeah.
more what's going on with them to make me want to slog through pages, more of these pages. But the first few books are really entertaining. In a way I hadn't expected, because I just hadn't expected to go on this journey with it.
Yeah, but yeah, I'll definitely check it out for sure. Okay, David, I think we can end things there.
Great.
I think that's a good way to bring it to a conclusion. A man running outside in his underwear with a cat that hates him. I love it. I love it. Okay.
It
But
it's
it's been
it's
great talking to you. I'll stay in touch, of course, about the episode, and it's probably available probably in a few days. But it's been
okay.
great talking to you and hearing your story. Obviously, talking about the Ndesa series. Loved it. Best of luck for the future, but I'll stay in touch. Okay.